everybody, I'm Pastor AJ Houseman, and welcome to 10-Foot Pole, a podcast to dig deeper into aspects of the Bible that get glossed over or totally ignored in most preaching. The Bible has a lot of parts that are racy, uncomfortable, and sometimes downright horrifying. Let's talk about it. Welcome to Season 4, Episode 4. We are now on Part 4 of our Judges study. And I'm super excited today to welcome back our guest is Pastor Bree Roberts from Christ Evangelical Lutheran Church in Millersville, Maryland. Welcome back.
Hello. I'm so glad to be here. I feel lucky to be here hang out with AJ again. So thanks for inviting me back.
Well, I appreciate all of your thoughts. I'm super excited to hear what you have to say about a hero like Samson.
Oh, yes. I have lots of thoughts.
So this is part 2 of us talking about Samson. So last week we talked with Pastor Elise specifically about the jawbone story in Samson's journey. We touched on some other stuff, other parts of his story, and I'm sure we will today. Samson is just like, so much violence happens that I thought we needed to have 2 episodes to really dive into all of Samson's violence.
Yes, I like part 1 and part 2. So now today's, what else violent can Samson get up to? So,
yes. So today we're going to pick up in the second half of Samson's story that I briefly mentioned last week, where he meets this other woman and falls in love with her or lust with her, whatever, however you want to view Samson's feelings towards Delilah. And of course, Delilah manages to trick him into telling him her secret of being a Nazirite. Information, and I actually did put the exact information about what it means to be a Nazirite from the Book of Numbers in the study guide. So for folks that are using that, it does explain a little bit more in depth of what that means. So today we're going to pick up and we're going to read Samson's last act of violence. And so this is Judges 16, and I'll read verses 23 through 31. And this is the New Revised Standard Version, Updated Edition. Just so you know, at this point in time, is Samson? Yes, Samson is in prison at this point in time. He's already been betrayed by Delilah. They chopped his hair off. He's lost his powers. He's in prison. Here we go.
He has no eyes.
And no eyes. Yes, he also has no eyes at this point in time, too. Those have been gouged out. Now the lords of the Philistines gathered to offer a great sacrifice to their god Dagon, and to rejoice, for they said, "Our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hand." When the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, "Our God has given our enemy into our hand, the ravager of our country, who has killed many of us." And when their hearts were merry, they said, "Call Samson and let him entertain us." So they called Samson out of the prison, and he performed for them. They made him stand between the pillars, and Samson said to the attendant who held him by the hand, "Let me feel the pillars on which the house rests, so that I may lean against them." Again, can't see. Now the house was full of men and women, and all the lords of the Philistines were there. And on the roof there were about 3,000 men and women who looked on while Samson performed. Then Samson called to the Lord and said, "Lord God, remember me and strengthen me only this once, O God, so that this will be one act of revenge. I may pay back the Philistines for my 2 eyes." And Samson grasped the 2 pillars which the house rested, and he leaned his weight against them, his right hand on one and his left hand on the other. Then Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." And he strained with all his might, and the house fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So those he killed at his death were more than those he killed during his life. Then his kindred and all of his family came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Estaol at the tomb of his father Manoah, and he had judged Israel for 20 years. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God, I guess. Or something.
I know, that's always my favorite, because it's always a question. Thanks be to God.
Right, it's so great. I love this. This is an awesome passage.
So,
Yes.
just a
Samson,
reminder for
violent to the
everyone
end.
again that this does not show up in our lectionary. So a lot of this stuff is like new for the listeners, right? Because if it doesn't show up on Sunday and you haven't like spent time to actually read or discuss some of these things, like Judges, this is a can be a first listening to some of this stuff.
And I think we have this like cultural knowledge of Samson and Delilah,
Mm-hmm.
but like we don't have as much about, well, how does this story end? And so like this is
Yeah.
like the gruesome conclusion of the Samson and Delilah story and what
Yeah.
happens, because that's why he doesn't have any eyes. So, we have to get there.
Let's talk about Delilah a little bit, because we don't actually like know a lot about her. So Delilah's introduction is different than most other women in the Bible, that she is not related. She is not told to us in relation to her father or her husband, which is out of character
Very
for
weird.
a lot of how women are described in the Bible. So she's some standalone woman, and we actually don't know if she's a Philistine or an Israelite. She's from Sorek, which is a border valley between Philistine, so Gaza, and the tribe of Dan. Early Christian commentary and Jewish midrash say that Delilah is a foreign woman. It feeds into this thing where that's why Samson lost his power, because the Israelites had a big thing about not tangling with foreign women, that was bad, and that's how he lost his power. But we don't actually know. So tradition does say that she's a Philistine. However, Delilah is a Hebrew name, but that may not be an indicator either. Some primary thoughts from some Jewish scholars as to why they believe she's a Philistine. We are told earlier in Samson's story that he likes Philistine women, so it makes sense that he would fall for another one. She deals with the Philistine rulers, and it would be unlikely for them to deal with an Israelite woman in this sort of transaction. And that she betrays an Israelite, quote, hero to his enemies. And that from a like an author standpoint, it would be unlikely for the author to write about one of his fellows being betrayed by his own without like pointing that out or saying so.
That's helpful for me. Yeah, I think it's all of that sort of muddies, I think, too, of what we know about Samson and Delilah. Like we think of her as this, she gets the same reputation as, her name comes to mean something, like a Jezebel. Like if you're a Delilah, you go with a Samson, right?
Yeah.
Who are you tempting? Who are you betraying? And so I think thinking about what her identity is we've assumed things about her identity. And there's some things we just can't know about her. And one of the things I read was like, and this text just calls us to fill in the gaps with
Yeah.
whatever we want to put in there so that she's the villain no matter what, but we can't always figure out why.
Yeah.
So,
Um, yeah, so I don't know. So this is my thing is I start to like discern and fill in those gaps. Like, why did Delilah do what she do? Did she just betray him? Like, did she not actually care for him at all? So, right, so we don't get that really commentary at all, right? We have no idea what her feelings towards him are. Is this just purely for monetary gain? Because like the amount of money that they give her is like astronomical.
right,
I think it's like 1,100 pieces of silver. And let's be clear, Jesus was betrayed for 30.
right, right. Plus inflation, right? So, like, this
Yeah,
is
yeah.
a lot of money. Like, and that they've clearly tried other ways. Like, how can we defeat Samson? Like, we can't these other ways. What do we know about Samson? Oh, he has this weakness for foreign women. This is the only
Yeah.
thing we know that we can exploit about this hero. I'm making air quotes because whether
Yeah.
or not he's a hero. Um, and like, so like, okay, what do we know about him? Oh, there was this other thing that happened. So like, there's this knowledge of who Samson is and like his proclivities of, ooh, he likes these kinds of girls. Let's
Yeah.
and like clearly it's worth the resources to invest in whatever getting
Oh, we have
Delilah into his bed is worth it.
And the amount, yeah, and the amount of money that they spend on it, right? Like how much that they want to undo Samson in this point. I mean,
Right.
like think about it. I mean, he's killed a lot of Philistines.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and so
Like
they're
a lot. And all of their
completely,
crops with the 300 foxes, like
yes, the foxes. I mean, and so like it's totally like in some ways too, like if this is war and this is the back and forth, like that makes sense. It's just like it's subverting the way war happens instead of like,
yeah.
oh, we're gonna do another assault and we're all gonna fail miserably because Samson has these powers that we can't conquer. But what can conquer him? Oh, right. He's flawed in very, I don't know, Greek tragedy kind of way. Like he's not capable of overcoming. If we send, warriors to him, yes, he's going to conquer them. But Delilah, one woman can topple Samson, right? Like it's,
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
So
So
yeah, so we had touched about this a little bit in Samson Part 1 as sort of like this is one of the only stories with one of these judges in these violent moments where like they're not at war.
yeah.
Like they're not in active battle. That like Samson's actions for all of his killing seem to be pretty personal, pretty
Mm-hmm.
self-motivated. It's
Yeah,
not
it's a
like he's
vendetta.
doing this, yeah, as a great, hero. This is where like I don't necessarily understand like why he's considered a hero, but
So fun thing I found is like there's a cycle, right? So in Judges, there's this cycle of
mhm,
the people are bad, and then bad things happen to them, and then they cry out of help, this terrible thing has happened to us, and then a hero comes to save them or vindicate
yes.
them in some way. And like this is now the last cycle of this. And I really feel like as you read this, like the wheels are coming off. Like this cycle of judges is not what like the previous ones of judges are because
Yeah.
it's not Samson is flawed. He's not this super great person to stand in as the hero. And there's certain chunks, like if you look at the biblical scholars, there's certain chunks that don't match up to this cycle and this
Yeah.
pattern that has already happened two more times. And so um, Samson is sort of doing this violence as a personal vendetta.
Hmm.
And, the bad things, are they quite that bad? I don't know. And there's not this cry to God from the people. And things I read were like, the cry comes from Samson himself.
Yeah.
Like, he says, kill me. And while you're killing me, take out all these Philistines, right? Like,
Yeah.
let my death be the thing that vindicates my people
Yeah.
for,
So we
all
do, I mean,
this.
it's so at the beginning of Samson's story, at the beginning of chapter 13, it does say that like that pattern, right? The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord gave them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. So we do get some sense that they are like oppressed by the Philistines, but it doesn't actually like ever talk about like that they go to sort of all out war with them.
Right, which we get in the other cycles. Like it's a
Yes.
different sort of space. And the thing too is you can imagine if you are getting bullied by oppressive people in some way. You're going to tell a story about some guy who was able to just take them all out, right?
Yep.
That there was this amazing guy and he was so powerful and they couldn't conquer him. And we feel better about ourselves because of this Samson guy. And so it's like, there's parts of this text that people say it doesn't fit in and it matches other things from other traditions. Like somebody said, this sounds a lot like the adventures of Hercules and all of the
Hmm.
things that Hercules has to go and do and conquer. And look at how great he is and look at how strong he is. And he has this
Hmm.
weird birth and he's so magical and look at him. Um, and so it has this markings of how do we tell the story of Samson and cram him into this cycle that exists
Yeah.
versus this totally makes sense. So for me, that was helpful to me to think about, okay, what are people doing if they're being oppressed? Of course, they're going to talk about a folk hero. They're going
Yeah.
to talk about someone who persists and survives. And even though these foreign women were trying to take him down, even though he's lost his eyes, he still finally gets the final word. And so then it's that and I think even the ending, it's like, oh, he dies, he gets buried, and he was a judge for 20 years. And like that's it. Like it feels very
Yep.
and it's also not the end of the book. Like there's still more judges to happen. And so it's just like peters out at the end. Like he kills the Philistines. Okay, there we
Yep.
go. Sure.
It's the end of his story.
Right. Right.
So, so the thing with Delilah, right? So like, yeah, I mean, like it really does, like if it was all manipulated, that like that makes sense, right? That like they figured out this is Samson's like one weakness and how do we take advantage of it? Modern like sort of some Christian schools of thought that like to again sort of like give reasoning, explain things away, say that well the devil was working through Delilah.
Sorry. Sorry. I
You can
couldn't
laugh.
stifle
It's fine.
my inner
But that
laughter.
has
Yes,
to be
right?
clearly the reason that she does what she does is because it is the devil who is working through Delilah against Samson.
Right. Which I mean, it, it's already a confusing story. And I think what people do a lot of times is if there's something that's confusing, that's cognitively dissonant, oh, it must be the devil. It's the
Yep.
devil. That's our easy out. We'll just blame it on that, them. It's all that. And so then you don't have to sit with a story that doesn't make sense. You
Yes.
can just, it makes it neat and tidy.
Yeah. And we established in the first episode of this with the rabbi that like Judaism doesn't believe in this like personified devil like Christians do. And would have even like our version of this personified devil coming on the scene, this would be before that anyways.
Mhm.
It's also like a Jewish text, right? Like that's not how
Right.
um that's not how they understand what happens and her actions here, but that is one thing that's put out there that clearly it must be the devil.
Right. And I
I
think it's our job as Christians to sort of make that distinction and say, that's our stuff.
yeah,
We need to own that that's our layer we put on top of it.
yes. I I think that there's like other motivations for what she does. Just like thinking about her as a woman in this place, like I'm wondering if like there's some fear involved, right? Like, does she really have
Mm,
a choice? Like, does she had in any way have the agency to go up against these Philistine leaders? Like, if she doesn't want to betray Samson, what are they going to do to her? Or, we know Samson's violent, right? Like, she's really kind of
right.
stuck between a rock and a hard place of violent men, right? And does she really have a choice? Does she kind of just have to follow through with this, or is it just wealth? We don't really know sort of what her motivations are. What
Yeah.
I do find really interesting though. So to think about the part of the story we didn't read about like she asked him to his secret to his power four times. And so after the first three times that he tells her a lie, and then the Philistines act upon this lie,
Mhm.
he has to know who gave them that information, right? Like he has to
Right.
know. So
Yeah.
why does he tell her?
Why does he keep telling her?
Why does he finally tell her the truth? Like what I mean, all we get is so verse 16, finally she had nagged him with her words day after day and pestered him, and he was tired to death.
right. Right. Which is playing into this terrible archetype we have of the nagging woman of,
Yeah.
like women are not using, like I read something that says the only weapon she has is her tongue. And we have
Mm.
that's all
Oh, she
through
has more weapons
Proverbs.
than that.
I know, but I mean, besides her feminine wiles, and that includes this. I mean, it's like that's the positive side, and the negative side of femininity is, oh my gosh, quit nagging me, woman, right? Like,
Yeah,
just let me be.
exactly.
And so like she's using either positively or negatively, like using these things, and like I can't even imagine having all of these Philistine men, whether or not you're you know Philistine or not, as Delilah. These men are like, hey, we really need to do this thing. We need you to do this thing, and they're giving her all this money, but still, it's like overwhelming to have
Yeah.
this group of men make like press upon you and say, do this thing. We need you to do this thing. Like, okay, you're going to pay me, but and like you said, she has no familial connection. So we don't know any, we don't know, is
Nope.
she, how is she connected? And it's just such a weird, aberrant thing as a
Mm-hmm.
woman in a biblical text to not have any, mother of, wife of, all of that. It's
Yeah.
just erased from her. And so, and that's like, okay, what she, I mean, my thing is, what does she do with this money after, we don't hear from her
No, we have
after,
absolutely no idea what happens after this.
right? And it's like, that is also very weird to me. And I think that's another gap of the story where why don't we don't, I mean, we don't get a satisfying ending. And it's not like, and then Delilah went and bought a house by the ocean and she was happy,
And she lived happily ever
until the end
after.
of time.
I
Right. And
like
we
that
don't
to
get
be true
that.
too. Yeah.
I
So
would like that for
so
Delilah.
that feeds into another thing that another thing that folks project on her is that she's a prostitute.
Right.
So someone who had to sell herself in order to like make money. And for a woman at this time, like it would have been because she was a widow or because she was abandoned, that she didn't have those familial things, and that was the only tools that she had to like make money for herself. And
Mm-hmm.
so if you look at her through that lens, right, that like of course, like having this amount of money, which would be like more than she would need to retire from anything for the rest of her life. I mean, that sounds like a good incentive if that is indeed part of her background. Or
Yeah.
maybe, do you know what? I like to think also too, maybe she's just a strong, independent woman and she's like, yeah, I don't need men.
Right.
I don't want men. I'm just gonna like, if I get this money, then I don't have to depend on men ever for the rest of my life.
Right. Which, like, I feel like people who originally were hearing this story, like, not, they might not make the same choices as Delilah, but like, they would have understand from not hearing about this character who's not connected to family, like, oh, she's either desperately needs to get these resources, or after she gets these resources, she's not beholden to anyone.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like this way she's liberating herself,
Or
but
it's just
like,
the devil.
or it's right. And she's then, but none of it goes like, by labeling her a prostitute, then we make Samson out to be like far too innocent for this whole thing. Like,
Yes.
we
Yeah.
make it all Delilah. And I'm like, hello, there were two people here who made it's a big old mess. Like, I would not want to, if these were real people, like the therapy bills would be high. But
Well,
like,
but it's also coming in with that perspective, right? Of like if you're coming in with the perspective that like Samson is a hero, then
mhm,
there's a need to, sort of villainize Delilah in this story, whether it's by the devil or
exactly.
whether she's a prostitute taking advantage of him and he's some innocent guy being, taken by her
Right.
feminine wiles, right? Like it yeah, like if you're coming at it from the perspective that he is an innocent hero, that he's then then it makes sense to try to explain Delilah away like that.
Right. Right. And it helps preserve the cycle and to see it and see like, okay, this is the one who was chosen. He had this birth, he has the hair, he has the
Hmm.
power, right? But I think this story, by the end you sort of see like, how was he a hero? Was he, I mean, he's
Yeah.
definitely powerful, but is he that great? Like, he's not, he's like, ugh. There's a lot of like things that happen and it's just negative. And something I didn't think about, it was a feminist scholar who was like wrestling like, what the heck do we do with Samson and Delilah? And it was,
Hmm.
what if Delilah knew about his previous wife? What if she knew about all the things that he had done before?
Hmm.
And so, like, if she knew about what happened and what happened to his wife, and then she gets given away to another man, and blah, 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 and all this terrible thing, like, that's going to color how Delilah is going to interact with Samson. And
Hmm.
she's going to, say, heck yes, I'm going to take this money, either because I'm a Philistine and he did this to my people, or he's
She's
clearly,
smart.
yeah. And like Delilah, um, knowing about Samson and his past will color how she's going to react once these Philistine men come and approach her and give her this opportunity. If she knows about what happened, if she's Philistine, it might be some sort of she's turning sort of the tables on Samson. She's
Hmm.
being the vigilante towards him in her way as a woman. And even if she's not Philistine, she might just be like, I don't feel as bad for taking advantage of Samson because he did all these terrible things.
Yeah.
And we don't, as with, I don't know, every biblical woman, we don't get to hear much of their interior dialogue at all.
No.
Um,
I just think she's smart, right? Like an opportunity is presented to her and whether or not she is kind of between this rock and a hard place, she does what she can to take care of herself in this. Because I think whether she's a Philistine or whether she is an Israelite woman, right? Like we have in the previous
mhm,
story, the Judeans give him over to the Philistines too, right? Like he
right.
is a violent, problematic guy. And so, I mean, there could be motivation even from the Israelite side of like, this is not who we want to be our hero, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
um this is not what we're about.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Again, we don't know. I don't have any idea if any of that's true, right? But like to me, there is motivations from like both sides on like this problematic character of Samson.
Yeah.
I do not fall
Right.
into the camp of like Samson's a hero. I not at all.
Same. Same.
I
I feel like,
Yeah, there are no real heroes in this story to me, any of it. We do hear that, right? Like him managing to take out all of like basically the Philistine leaders, like was probably, really good in Israelites in their favor, as they were oppressed by them. So like I mean, that's why he comes out as this hero. If he, through his own act of like selfish vengeance, does manage to still do the work of God.
right. It's sort of the grand kind of conclusion is, well, it all's well that ends well. Like he
Mhm.
is called out to God, and it doesn't, like it is not, he's not taking his own life. He is asking God to do this thing through his death. And so it's like, don't worry about that whole remember I killed all those Philistines, right? Fine. It's totally fine. Just pay no attention to all the other Samson exploits.
I wonder if like this is a moment of opportunism from God. That like
Mm.
maybe Samson didn't live up to who he was supposed to be. He wasn't quite the deliverer that God wanted him to be after giving him this miraculous power, but God sees the opportunity of like, well, I still need to deliver my people. And despite the circumstances, I can still deliver my people through Samson in this way,
Yeah.
in this one final act of, because we do see, he prays to God. God gives him this power. So obviously, God, is ordaining this kind of violence against the Philistines through Samson. So
Mm-hmm.
that's just how I like, maybe I'm trying to, sort of my working theology around it is like, here's God's opportunity to deliver God's people even through such a problematic person
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah, I
also
mean,
take
I
care
think
of
you're
that person's problems at the same time.
just two birds, one stone.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the dynamic of the greater sort of biblical narrative of Judges is in this funny spot
Hmm.
where there's this thing that keeps happening to God's people, and God is taking care of them, even though they are being unfaithful, even though all
Hmm.
this violence is happening to them. And then they get to this cycle, and it degenerates all along the way. And eventually, I mean, it'll take a while, but they'll say, we would like to have a king, please.
Yeah.
You are not enough, God. We would like to have a king. And so this is like
We we
this
need some
place.
we need some more on the ground leadership here from you.
Right. You're not good enough, God.
Mhm.
And so could you please do this? And like, so I think in this place of, okay, we're trying this judges thing again, are God's people going to continue the habit of, well, let's see if the last cycle, how long it'll hold. I get the sense of like, um, I am a mother to two children, and when I clean the house, I don't have the children here because if the children are here, they are still the mess makers inhabiting the place I'm trying to get clean. So I get the sense of God as a parent, like, I just cleaned up in here.
Yeah.
I just liberated you guys. And now you're doing this again. Like, hello, like, have you learned nothing? And of course, we're seeing this over the scope of generations and all of this happens. But I get the sense, like you said, like God is caring for the people by eliminating the most foreign of foreigners, these Philistines, right? Got to wipe them out to take care of my people. But it's like, this is who I have to work with. I have Samson.
Yeah.
I don't,
And
it's
you know
not,
what? Like it doesn't even stop at judges, right? Like
yeah,
they're I mean like even when they get the kings, they're not perfect and they continue to do this stuff and like so God sends prophets and like okay, let's try again. Let's try it this way this time.
right. You're still being unfaithful. You're still coveting the way that these
You
other
still
nations
don't get
around
it.
you.
Yeah.
Right. And I feel like that's this cycle. It's like it echoes this other cycle. And it's like, and so like for me, it's like, what is, and eventually it'll be like, and I'm letting this happen to you. I'm letting Babylon is on their way.
Yeah.
And here we go. And so like God finally says, okay, I took care of the Philistines, but I'm gonna let you get taken to Babylon. I mean, and that's a whole thing. But like God is, like you said, ordaining this violence um against the Philistines as an answer to people's, suffering. And it's sort of like um frustrating. I mean, I can't imagine to inhabit the divine mind, but to be so in love with a people that even though they continue to be disobedient and continue to enact this violence, either, like God never says, hey, I don't, like it just feels like Samson is with this personal nature of the violence that he's enacting.
Hmm.
It feels different. And it's like, is this really what God has in store? And I think that's why Judges um, isn't in our lectionary hardly at all. It's only in it twice. And I think it's just reprehensible for us because we can't imagine why are we, doing this and why is it in God's name? And I think we would love to think that we aren't that violent, but we are.
Mm, yeah.
And so I think like that's why I really am glad you're diving into this because Judges is a book that sort of reflects truths back to us about being human. And
Ooh.
I think it's, honest and it's like, yeah, we are like Samson and we are like Delilah and we, like I'm not strong enough to pull down any pillars or anything like that. But there are times and moments when I, as a person in the 21st century, absolutely enact violence that way. I'm more removed from it because I
Mm,
have a cell phone and I live in a house with, internet most of the time and air conditioning and things like that. But like, um, there's violence enacted against the planet, against other people, against marginalized communities,
yeah.
and I am insulated from it. But would I say, like Delilah offered this opportunity? I don't think most of us, given that same, would be like, could I like enough money to retire if someone said, all you have to do is,
Yeah.
tell us Samson's secret. And I'd be like, hmm. And I bet most of us would probably take the Philistines up on their offer, which
Yeah.
I think is not something I want to either as a pastor, like standing up there on Sunday morning saying the word of the Lord. And now I have to craft a sermon about it because,
Yeah.
yeah,
That's also why it's probably not a lectionary. Kindness towards pastors.
right.
Um,
I appreciate that.
but I think so. You said something that kind of does draw, for me, especially from a Lutheran perspective, some of our theology into this is this idea that like God is always coming to us over and over again. That like God loved these people so much that even when they are unfaithful, God continues to come to them with salvation. That even though they keep doing these things, or even though Samson even keeps on doing this stuff, God
Right.
still came to him at the rock and gave him something to drink. That God is still continuing to try to care for and guide these people and continue to give them second chance after third chance after 50 millionth chance of continuing to come to them and say, I love you. Let's try it another way. I love you. Let's try it another way. I love
Hmm.
you. What else can we do here?
Right. Yeah. And God's continuing to seek out, how do I honor this covenant that
Mm-hmm.
I will be your God and you will be my people. And that's not up for discussion, right? Like
Yeah.
that is the way it is. And that's why it's so terrible when you continue to betray me. Like
Yeah.
we get the image of an unfaithful spouse, but to
But I
think
love
like
you
God,
anyways, and I'm gonna keep helping you.
right, to the extent like you can't get rid of me. Like there is
Yeah.
nothing, no, if God says, if we can get through the book of Judges, like literally there's nothing you can do that's worse than, the we're probably good at finding new ways to be terrible, but God says, and that's for me like what the point of scripture is it shows us God's past actions to
Mm-hmm.
predict future actions. Like
Ooh.
if God can be faithful to Samson when Samson is, you know, his eyes are gouged out, he's chained up as entertainment by the people who, did this to him and whom he murdered their kinsfolk. Like if God can use that deeply flawed human to cause, to do what God wants to do, like it's ordaining violence, and like I'm not a huge fan of that God, but okay. Um
Mm-hmm.
but to say God is willing to stand with flawed people and will not abandon us in the midst of how flawed we are and how
Mm-hmm.
imperfect we are and how it's deeply human we are. Like God's that if God is willing to accompany God's people through the book of Judges, which we all like, we're reading our Bible, we just go skip past it. Like God is therefore, I think, willing to accompany us when we are faced with impossible decisions and,
Yeah.
the consequences of terrible actions that we do take part of, whether or not we know we are or not. The very Lutheran thing, the things we have done and the things we have left undone.
Yeah.
Um, God loves us and says, I love you. What else can we try?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to me, yeah, that's when I think about like what do these stories tell us about God? It continues to tell
Yeah.
me that God is with them, even through killing sprees, even through the hardest things that they go through, even through a, as flawed a person as Samson.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think then that is for me like a reason I'm saying this begrudgingly as a preacher, as a pastor, like why Judges is maybe the perfect book to be reading right now. Like,
Mm,
because Pastor AJ is so smart. Like, this is the place where we need to be in a time when we are living in a time of violence and chaos, and the world, it's the 21st century version versus a much more ancient version. But
hmm.
like, I can see myself in these characters of Judges if, I'm able to sort of dig down and find the roots of these deeply human people, and
Yeah.
so I think this is a book for chaotic times to say, okay, this is how God and God's people navigated these chaotic times, and okay, there's a lot of things happening, and how do we then say in the midst of what we're living through, what's the analogy, how does it transfer over, what's useful and what's
Yeah.
not? There's going to be things where we're like, okay, I don't need to do anything with the jawbone, don't need to have radical haircuts that somehow change things of personal power, but what can these people of Delilah and thinking about her without the layer of it's just the devil or she was a prostitute, but thinking about her as a complex person who made a decision and then had to live with the repercussions of that.
Yeah.
And we are left to figure that out and imagine that on our own, and to think about Samson, who dies in this heroic way after having other, not so, like, are we proud of Samson? Maybe not. But he gets to be buried, and like they bury him and he's honored as this
Yes.
judge.
I love that that is
And so,
included.
right, like so so that tells me that people would go and, you know, the way that other ancestors' graves are revered, like you knew where Samson was buried as
Yeah.
this judge who was our judge for 20 years. We're, past that now, but people knew and remembered him and his stories. So that's a example and resource to God's people after this time
Mhm.
has passed.
This is really not helpful for the conversation, but I was just thinking about Delilah and like, she really is like the winner of this whole thing, right? Like if I were to make
Absolutely.
this into a movie, right? Like at the end of it, they're all dead, Samson's dead, and she's just riding off into the sunset with her big bag of gold or silver. And
Silver. Yeah. Yeah.
like, oh wow.
Right. And it's more like it's like the whoever's telling us the story, like Delilah has done her part, and so now she doesn't matter. And I feel like that is very that's repeated by women in
Yeah.
biblical text all the
Yeah.
time. Like you hear them and then they disappear, and it's like okay, but we don't know. Like I think about what happened to Ruth after she has this baby. What happens to Rahab after she helps the spies? What happens to we talk about like the daughters of there's so many stories where we hear about women and something happens and they don't get a resolution. They don't get a burial like Samson. And they
Yeah.
just are like, they're just, the camera pans away and they're gone, so I think that also I've loved how that leaves space and room for us to interpret and imagine and think about in a different way because Samson, we know how his story ends, and there's a monument to it, and so Delilah has no monuments. Delilah gets called all these things, and we're
Yeah, she
left
just gets
with it.
painted as like a terrible picture of her that she's
Right,
so evil in this story.
right, and I wonder too, like how many like if this story has existed for so long, and I'm a person who's super like into like names and who we name people after. Like, how many people are named Delilah? Like,
Yeah.
nobody's gonna go name their kid Jezebel, but like, are there many Delilahs? Are there many like
Yes.
Samsons? Are like it's just a really interesting thing. Like, their stories exist and persist, and what does that say about like are you going to name your daughter Delilah? Is that going to say something or not? I mean, and like, then I think all I can think about the whole time we've been talking is, Hey There, Delilah,
I know.
the
I've been
song.
trying really hard not to sing it this whole
Me
time. It's
too.
taken like
Okay, good job, us.
all of my
I'm
power.
sorry. So, like, to think, and I'm like, this song is incredibly popular, like, overplayed on every radio station. And like, and I'm sure, like, there's the average person who has no biblical literacy and is like, hey, that's a nice name. And then imagine if they name their kid that and they have no idea. And I'm just like, somebody's going to open Judges and be like, who am I named after? Like, what did you do, mom? Like, but
I like to think that it wouldn't be such a bad name, as I like to try to reclaim Delilah's story for herself, that this strong,
yeah,
independent woman did her thing and was smart, worked with the tools that she had, and came out on top. So, like,
yeah.
good, there's worse people to be named after,
Oh, absolutely. Oh,
in
yeah,
my opinion,
for
about
sure.
how I take this, but.
Yes.
Okay. So I want to get into these possibilities of how Christians sort of work through the theology of the Old Testament violence. So option one,
Okay.
we can reject the depictions of God here as inconsistent with the God revealed to us in Jesus. That like any violent descriptions of God are human projections onto God.
Okay. Am
What
I
do you think?
going one by one?
Yeah.
Or do you? Oh, so, oh gosh. I feel like that would be nice if that worked out. But I feel like we are. inheritors of the text, and I don't like the Christian. I don't know if it's Christian or just evangelical or just people who, want to not have to worry too much about things. I think our tendency, even as Lutherans, is to say the New Testament is all gospel and the Old Testament is all law. And that's not true. And so I think
Yeah.
to say we have to reject violence and say it doesn't, like, it's uncomfortable and it's inconsistent and it needs to stand. So I don't like that one, AJ. I don't like it.
Okay. Okay. Option
Okay.
two.
Okay.
We can reinterpret the descriptions of violence to make them less confronting, that they are like literary hyperboles when it says like killed every living thing, that's just a hyperbole to exemplify how violent that it was, but that it wasn't actually like as bad.
I think some of this comes from how are we looking at this text and are we interpreting it literally, or are we imagining like, oh, this is an ancient people telling a myth about things that they were trying to figure out? Like maybe it was for their perspective every living thing and that's how they wanted to tell the story, but like I don't think I need the text to be literal in the way that I think this perspective assumes. Like I don't need the text to be literal. So like I mean,
I think that's what it's saying, right? Is that you can view it less literal and think of it more as a hyperbole.
yeah. I so like I'm 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 okay with it. I'm not like ringing endorsement of it, but I would be okay with it.
Okay.
Okay. But I want to hear all of them and then I might change my answer, just
Okay.
FYI.
You also don't have to like any of them.
I know. I know. So I might go back and say, no, I don't like that one, but I'll hear the other two. Let's see.
We can assert God's right to judge the world this way, that it is God's right to give life and take it away.
Oh gosh. Man, AJ, this is hard. Um, I don't like this one. I don't like it. That's my answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
And option number four, we can recontextualize the violence within the story. Seeing the violence within the bigger context of God's plan. For example, Judges is supposed to be the horrific, dark sequel to Joshua and pre-Kings.
I feel like that's like giving, it's like putting too much credit on things like, oh yeah, and this is exactly how it's supposed to happen. Whereas I don't know. So I don't like that one either. I'm still okay with hyperbole and understanding it non-literally. That's my one that I'm okay with. But the other three I don't really like them because I think it's the thing where we try and make the text, and I think this is a Christian thing that we do to explicitly Jewish texts, is we try to make it answer a question that the text is not concerned about at all. And like we want it to answer things that no Jewish person ever asked them. And it's like, we're just like, hi, give us the Christian answer. And we like shake
Yeah.
it hard enough. Like, please give us the Christian
Yep,
answer.
yep.
Um, so, all right. That was harder than I thought it was going to be, AJ. Ooh,
Well, I listen, these are hard things to wrestle with and hard things for
I
us
know.
to like, build our working theology around because our scripture, like
Right.
we have this as canonical scripture that this is a part of God's
Right.
story. And so like how do we do with it? Do we take that approach that we're reinterpreting everything in the light of Jesus? Do we take the approach that this is humans, sort of depiction of how their relationship with God is? Do we take it as hyperboles of well, God clearly wasn't killing everyone, right? Or, how do we try to understand these things? And how do we put them in perspective of our own faith?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think for me, if you dig into learning about how canon is made, like it's going to make you uncomfortable if sort of just want it to be tied up in a neat little bow. I mean,
Yeah.
and to think about, that it's that's why I deeply resonate with sort of the ELCA position of it's an inspired work. It's not literal. It's not perfect, but it has the living, breathing thing that is the norm of our life. Does that mean we're going to go copy what Judges does? No, but it's like I said, it's honest and it tells us about, God's people enduring and trying to figure out how to be faithful in the midst of this time. And I feel like,
Mhm.
well, okay, I need that a little right now. So thanks, Judges, for the
Yeah,
hyperbole.
it's not
And
like so like it's not so for me what's important I think to distinguish with this idea of like a literal interpretation is like some of the parts where it says and the spirit of the Lord came into him, right? Or that God said, go do this. That when you get those phrases, if you want to take them literally, like it could be justification for ongoing violence. It could be justification that God wants you to
mhm,
kill a bunch of people. And I think for me, it's really important to understand this in the context of this is a part of the Israelite journey, right? And this was about them learning to be who they were and how they existed in that place and time. But that it's not God saying, if you do it in my name, it is okay to be violent.
right, right. Yeah, I mean, and I think this is the thing of this is, however many generations post wandering around the wilderness, God wandered them around. And I love the concept that comes, it's a wilderness school. God is trying to teach them how to be God's people, these
Hmm.
Israelites who are liberated, just liberated from enslavement. And so now then we get into entering the land in the book of Joshua. And then this is sort of like, okay, now we're in the land. This continues to be what it's like to be in the land as God's people. And it's not sunshine and rainbows. So
Yeah.
remember how we were complaining about things? Oh, yeah, there's still more things to complain about.
Well, also, so this is just like, a historical thing to think about too. And I try to remind listeners of this, of like, yes, God promised them this land and but it wasn't empty. Like people
Indeed.
already lived there.
Indeed. Yes. And one of the things that I think is really important to remember is if you are a person who is living in an occupied land, you're going to hear this text very differently.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of indigenous scholars who've done lots of great work about this.
Hmm.
But like if you're indigenous, you might identify more with the Canaanites or the Philistines in these stories. And I think that's another place where we, in the time where we're living in times of war and empires occupying places and lots of violence being enacted, we need to sort of pay attention to that lens and say, who is who's going to read the text in one way and who's going to read it in another, and to see, like you said, like the concept of terra nullius, of empty land, is something that is a very American thing to be aware of,
Yes.
considering we
Yep.
come from a place where people were,
Already lived
extracted from,
there.
yeah, and then we kicked them out, murdered them, put them on reservations, and imported, millions of people from Africa to do the work. So it's a not an uncomplicated thing to see ourselves in, as God's people.
Hmm.
Ever since these texts have existed, have been able to see themselves in these texts.
Hmm.
And so to recognize perspectives like that, I think is really, really crucial. And I know for me as a pastor, whenever I share something that's like, have you ever considered how the Philistines or Canaanites felt about these Israelites showing up? And people are
Hmm.
like, I never thought about that. And I'm like, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think, and it can, I think the other thing that's hard for us is um, having a multiplicity of truths, and to say both things can be true, or
Yeah.
it's true and I can evolve and change my mind about it and say different things about different parts of these stories of God's people, as I'm in a different place or the world's in a different place.
Hmm. Well,
So
also,
I
like
think
you
that's
said, just
critical.
and this is a thing that I always like to, like one of the points of the podcast, right, is to bring in some of those other perspectives. How do we read this differently? How does an indigenous Christian read the scripture, and what do they take out of it?
Right.
And so it's important for
Right.
us to stop and think about and challenge some, historical Christian beliefs about some of these things, recognizing that most of our like historical, like church doctrine and theological writings came from people who were on the side of the empire.
Right, exactly. And I think it comes, and you know, it comes from how do we read this if we are Christian from, a place that was colonized and now has, you know, gained independence. That's going to be a different perspective. If you're, if you were South African reading this, what would that feel
Yeah.
like in the place of surviving and then coming past apartheid? Like that's going to be a different perspective. Whereas the United States, I think we have lots of thoughts about who we are and what we are, but like, um, bolstering ourselves using the Bible as a tool is, I think, we would like to use certain parts, but there's other parts where I think there's parts of Judges that would deeply apply to American life and American
Yeah.
history, and we don't want to read them. We're not comfortable with that, and it's like I would just rather turn away and not pay attention to that. We like the nice, the sunshine and rainbows and Jesus loves the little children.
Mm-hmm.
But there's the violent bits. We'd like to just, we'll glue those pages together in our Bible and not have to deal with them.
Or we talked about like, do a Thomas Jefferson thing and just cut them out.
Yeah, that works too. Yes. We'll have a deist Bible. It'll be great.
There you go. But yeah, thanks so much for joining us to wrestle with another hard conversation. And I think we've given people a lot to think about and talk about, and maybe do some more research on some of these other schools of theological thought. And so I'm excited to read more about that. So thank
Mm-hmm.
you, Pastor Bree, for introducing those.
Thank you, Pastor AJ. I am glad to be here and contribute to the wrestling and be a wrestler.
Yes. Well, that's part of it, right? Like that's what our faith is continuing to wrestle with God and to wrestle with these, what does it mean for us to be a follower of God? And what does it mean for us to have this in our scripture? And how does that influence our faith? So those are
Exactly.
our continued wrestlings. Remember, everyone, you can get a hold of the study guide at 10footballpodcast.com/judges to get all of the study guides that go along with these episodes. And remember that you can always learn more about the podcast and find us on Facebook and Instagram at 10football podcast and wherever you listen to podcasts. The 10 Football Podcast is a ministry of the Delaware Maryland Synod. To learn more, go to demdsynod.org. Take care and see you next week for some more violence.